Good to see each of you. We are studying the topic of how we got the Bible. We have taken quite a journey, and I thank you for bearing with me in this journey. We are kind of finishing up and getting to where we're talking about modern translations. We spent last week, we noticed the King James and we talked about it. And we talked about the American Standard 1901, and now we're going to try to move forward through some others. And I would like to, I think there are 4 at least that I would like to cover. And so if I seem to be moving quickly through a point or something like that, understand that, number one, it may be the case that several Bibles deal with a particular subject, and I may cover it in another under one of the others. And so as we go through that, I'll try to let you know. But one of the things that I think is important and that I want to make clear as we're going through this is that, because I get the question often, what's the best Bible translation? What's the best Bible version out there? And that's really almost a loaded question, depending on who you ask, and depending on the answer maybe that they give. It could be quite a contest that begins after that's the case. After an answer is given. But one thing that I'm trying to do as we go through this is to be fair to each of these translations and give them a look at maybe the committee, maybe give them a look at their preface and what they were attempting to do, to put them on this scale. Then this is not Wayne's work. These are others who have decided this. We looked at some other charts as well in this. This is kind of the easiest one to see at a distance, but anyway, you kind of get an idea, and we talked about this. So I kind of want to set the stage at the beginning of each of these classes because it's important, and I'd like for each class to almost stand alone. Now, if you have questions about the King James or American Standard, then I would direct you back to last week's lesson. You can find that on YouTube and go, and you can take your time through it because you can then pause it. I don't pause very well, and so I know that about me. And so if you're pointing a remote back at me in this auditorium, it just doesn't hardly work. I'll just tell you. So I have a hard time with remotes myself. But anyway, you have on one end of the scale, word for word, literal translation, you might call it. And then you get toward the middle and toward the other end, the thought for thought, or what scholars would call a dynamic equivalent versus a formal equivalent, the word for word being formal. It's after the form of the original language. And a thought for thought is more dynamic. In other words, they begin to take those literal words and take out the Greek and maybe even Aramaic idioms that are found therein, and they try to change them and make it sound more modern. And so, and I can appreciate that, and I think you can too, because at some point in time, let's face it, even the King James was a new translation, right? And so they had to deal with that, and it's not perfect. It has some flaws, and we talked about that. We talked about the good qualities and the bad, and so one of the things that we'll do in this as we go through each of these, kind of show the good, the bad, and the ugly, so to speak. But what I don't want you to walk away from this class is thinking that there's no good translation. What I'm trying to do is give you the tools so that you can determine for yourself what's best for you to use. And sometimes that has to do with, am I just trying to read? Or am I trying to dig in and study something a little bit deeper? And so sometimes having some built-in tools of some of the older translations, like the King James or the American Standard, are helpful in that. Or a more literal translation. Or if I'm looking for something that might be a little bit easier to read, then I may come this direction on the chart. Now, paraphrase, and I've said this before, I'm sure it has its purpose, but not so much for me. Now, somebody may look at a paraphrase, but it is just that. They take what is, and depending on which, and usually paraphrases are made after, they may take another text or translation and then basically take that and paraphrase it. So, it could be any translation. Maybe somebody takes the English Standard Version or something like that, and then makes a paraphrase out of it, and then they call it something else, the English Standard Paraphrase or whatever. Mark my words, it'll come. But anyway, because that's the trend right now, are some of these things. What's the problem with what we have seen so far in the translation process and these different versions? What's one of the problems that we run into on our scale from literal to paraphrase? What's the problem that we could run into? Say again? It's all humans. That's a good point. It's all humans. So what does that mean for us? Yeah. And so what we have then is someone's interpretation that we're reading as a paraphrase. Clearly. And we can say that we all have some preconceived ideas. And so that's the need for then a committee of obviously non-biased scholarly types, right, to do this kind of work. To find that is difficult because we're all human. That's the issue. Lee.
Is it true that from one translation to another, that there has to be a certain amount of it changed in order to achieve the copyright law? So that can be. So if the new American Standard was really, really good, someone trying to make money off of another version can't duplicate that. They have to change the wording at least a certain percentage. And I've heard 20%, but I don't know what the actual number is, but yes, that is true. That's kind of money driven, which is kind of scary. So that makes you want to go back to when it wasn't the point of the sale and make money, like when the original translations were made.
Just trying to get a copy into the people's hands that they could read, right? Yeah. When that was the intent, obviously it's going to come out better, you would assume. So that's, so there are a myriad of issues that certainly could come up. And so Lee brought up the New American Standard, so that's where we're starting tonight. And so let's kind of dive right in. And again, try to give you enough background of it. Jeff?
I will, just like, when I say like an American Standard, not the American Standard version, and also the stuff like that, compared to King James, I turn around and take the Old Testament. There is quite a bit on the Old Testament that there is words in there in the Old Testament. I'm trying to be mean, but there's words I can't pronounce. And I'm just turning around and I'm saying there's the New American Standard that might can, ease, the burden, will go easier on it.
And sometimes that is certainly the case. When it comes to proper names, so many of those that you find in the Old Testament, it doesn't matter which translation you go to, you're going to have to still deal with those names somehow and try to get them as best you can. So as far as some of the archaic words that are difficult, that's the need for the modern translation. And that's what's pushed all of this, these other Bibles, as well as certainly, as Lee pointed out, certainly there are publishing companies that are one of the most popular ones. Actually, two of the most popular ones are one that published this, as well as, I think this is the Lockhart Foundation that published the New American Standard. And then you have the Crossway group who published the English Standard. That's one of the most, one of the newer ones that I certainly think is worthy of our look at and studying. The point being is that when they're driven that way from a publishing standpoint, we can see kind of what might be the leading point or intent. And I will tell you that most of them are very upfront with what they're attempting to do right there in the preface. They'll tell you. And so just as with any book, if you read the preface, it kind of sets the stage. This is what we have attempted to do. That's what the preface is. And so that's important. And you all have copies that you can go and look. And so let's dive into this, though. The New American Standard. Obviously, there are several versions of it. 63, 71, and 95 updated. So you'll see the New American Standard -U, NASB -U indicates that it's the 95 version. And so you can see 58 scholars were used by Lockman Foundation. They are the same ones that produced the Amplified Bible. Let me say something just very quickly about the Amplified Bible, because you probably noticed that most of these groups, or most of those, I think all the charts that I showed you, that most of them listed the Amplified Bible as one of the most literal Bibles. And there's some issues with that. And part of that is simply because it really reads like a paraphrase in many ways, but part of what has happened with they call it the amplifications. So it's the New Amplified Bible. So they have the translation of a particular verse, and then they have amplifications. That's hard to say. Amplified phrases. That's what they've added to it. And what those amplifications are typically commentary. Not in every case, but they often are. And so sometimes they fail to indicate, even when there is when they have when there's an alternate rendering. One of the things that most of your Bibles will do, if there is, for instance, we talked about this, if there was a word that was supplied by the translators to help something make sense in both the King James and the American Standard, that word was italicized, typically. And so you knew right off the bat, this word, I could read this sentence without it, but it certainly flows better with it. And most of the time you can see that it really doesn't change the wording of God's Word, and the meaning of God's Word. That's not always the case with the Amplified Bible. So just a heads up, the group that made the Amplified Bible is this Lockman Foundation, which has produced the New American Standard. And so there are a couple other things. It did follow somewhat closely its predecessor, in other words, the ASB, 1901. Though it found, really, it used Nessel's Greek, 23rd edition, rather than the underlying text that was used for the American Standard 1901. And so it says the New American Standard. It didn't really, it references, the scholars, they reference the New American, or the American Standard 1901, but they used a different Greek text. And so it does come out differently. And so, in fact, the Nessel's Greek text resembles more the Textus Receptus, which was what the King James is actually based on. And so So what'll happen is when you're comparing Bibles, and if I want to read this letter, this New Testament letter by Paul, and I want to read it in the King James, I want to read it in the American Standard 1901, I'm going to read it in the New American Standard, and so if you did that, the New American Standard would probably read closer to the King James just because of the Greek text that was used. And so that's just, again, this is part of that critical textual criticism that people are involved in this process of translation and so forth. Now, one of the things, it's more readable than others, than even the American Standard, and some would say much more even than the King James. And certainly in many passages, it is. One thing, and a comment was said to me the other day, and I can't remember who told me this, so I'm just going to steal it and act like it was mine and they can get on to me later. No, I'm teasing. Somebody did tell me, though, that they said that the King James, one of the nice things about it, because of the language that it was written in, that it flows very well. And that's natural because it's a much more poetic type of language, that Old English. And so it's going to flow more naturally that way. And that's the way that it was, sentence structure and so forth, was made to do, so that it could be very readable. Obviously, 350 plus years later, those words, some of them are archaic, and we struggle maybe with some of that. But I would tell you that most people that grew up on the King James, even when they quote a verse today, they may be using maybe using the New American Standard on a regular basis, but when they quote, they're quoting what they've used all their life, probably. And many people have used the King James all their life. It wasn't that hard to come up with and figure out and to spend some time in it. But the New American Standard is more readable with its close adherence to those original languages. And I think that's something that's certainly a good quality of it. Another good feature of the New American Standard, it uses brackets to indicate words probably not in the original. So in the same way that there were italicized words that were not part of the original text in the King James, the New American Standard has done it a little bit differently. For instance, I'll give you an example. If anybody's using the New American Standard, you can go to John chapter 5 and verse 4 in that passage. And remember, that's the passage that talks about, this is the man who was waiting on someone he needed help to get into the water. And there's an explanation given. We talked about this in our John class. In verse 4, not in the original text, but it was added and supplied because of what was going on during that day. That they thought that an angel came and stirred the water. And so the first one into the water would be healed. And so that was the superstition of the day. And so in many translations it's added, but there's usually a footnote that says that it was added. That most manuscripts do not, the manuscript evidence does not include that particular verse. Well, one of the nice things that the New American Standard does is it actually has in the marginal notes, it has, or matter of fact, in John chapter 5, verse 4, it just has a set of parentheses, and it says, literally, see marginal notes. And then it gives you that information about missing manuscript evidence to support that verse being in there, though obviously the King James uses it and so forth. But anyway, so that's one nice thing that helps you, and I think it's very good. The New American Standard Committee, however, through its footnotes, and this is one thing, obviously, when you're talking about, this is a work of humanity. You have, in the New American Standard, one of the problems is that it's through its footnotes that they actually denied messianic prophecy in several of their footnotes. That's a problem, obviously, that it faces. And so Genesis 3:15, Genesis 49:10, Numbers 24:7, numerous passages, there was a footnote margin, or marginal note as a footnote, that makes, that whatever statement they made, And there was, in fact, clearly a denial of the Messianic prophecies that are listed here. Some of those have been corrected. And so again, we're talking about 3 different versions have come along of the New American Standard. So it's been updated several times, and so it's been corrected. Most of these have been corrected. As far as I know, all of those listed there have been corrected in those footnotes. But in the earlier versions of the New American Standard, they would still use thee and thou and thy when referencing God until you get to the 95 update. And in the 95 update, you have you or your when referring to deity, then they was capitalized, and so that's certainly a help. However, those referring to Christ were not. And so there seems to be an issue there with this particular committee because of the marginal notes that they've made where they've denied Messianic prophecy, and then clearly a reference to God, and they capitalize you and your, except when it refers to Christ. And so that certainly is a problem. However, I looked this up in several different electronic versions of the New American Standard, and I don't find that to be the case at all. And so several passages referencing the Christ and so forth, someone speaking to Christ, then it's still capitalized in the electronic editions. Now, I haven't looked at every one of them, so I don't know, but it seems to be at least corrected in the electronic versions of the 1995 update of the New American Standard. Let me give you one way that this has happened by way of these prophecies. In Genesis 49:10, it says, "The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet until Shiloh comes." That's a good translation. I don't have a problem with the translation. But then there are a couple of footnotes. It says, the rest of that verse was, "And to him shall be the obedience of the peoples." And so then the footnote, though, says, "Or until he comes to Shiloh." It says, "Or until he comes to whom it belongs." The reference of Shiloh is a reference to the Christ. And so again, this Messianic denial in the footnote, that certainly is problematic. There is inconsistency with an English word found in Matthew 5:32. The word that is typically translated in most of your versions as either sexual immorality or, in the modern versions, sexual immorality or fornication. In the King James as well as the American Standard. This is the use of the word unchastity is used here in Matthew 5:32. Matthew 19:9, immorality is used, that's the Matthew 19:9 passage, for the word that is the Greek word porneia. And that particular word, the problem with that is that would actually permit an easy divorce, or really for any reason. Unchastity or even immorality, doesn't even say sexual immorality in that particular passage the way it was translated. And so that certainly is problematic. When you see the Greek word literally means illicit sexual activity. And so it's not talking about pornography, it's not talking about numerous other things that could be considered unchaste or could be considered even just immoral. And so they leave it open to any immoral act would be a reason to divorce, according to Matthew 19:9 in the New American Standard. So that obviously is a problem passage in the New American Standard. It also translates in Romans 12 in verse 1, which is your spiritual service of worship. Worship is not in the original. and I think I've preached on this and probably have mentioned it several other times about this particular passage. But this translation is not alone. It's not the only one that does that. But that has, it's my understanding, this has probably caused many people to go with the idea that all I do in service to God is worship. But not all service is worship. Some service is work. And so the spiritual service of worship is really a bad translation, and I believe it's caused a good bit of problem. Reasonable service, spiritual service, any of those would be good translations of that passage. That's Romans 12 and verse 1. The New American Standard's "You shall not commit murder" is actually much better. And so here's another good thing about it. The way that it translates Matthew 5:21, 19:18, Luke 18:20, and so forth, other passages dealing especially with something coming out of the Old Testament, is even a better translation than we find in the King James or American Standard. New American Standard has better translations of James 3:3, bits in the horse's mouth. King James does as well. Predestined is used there at Ephesians 1 and verse 5, Romans 8:29, which is a more literal translation of that word. Sea monster instead of whale, Matthew 12 and verse 40. Every week, and so it's talking about giving there in 1 Corinthians 16 verse 2. And so it's on the first day of every week, and so it does a good job translating that. There is an explicit contradiction in Matthew 5:17, Ephesians 2:15, where the New American Standard, I'll put both these verses up here. "Do not think that I am come to abolish the law or the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill." And then turn right around, Ephesians 2:15 says, "By abolishing in his flesh the enmity, which is the law of commandments contained in ordinances, so that in himself he might make two into one new man, thus establishing peace." He says, "I don't think that I've come to abolish the law. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill." And then turn around, and Paul says he came to abolish in his flesh the law. Well, that reads as a contradiction, but that's because it is a bad translation. There are better words that are used there. You'll find this in several translations, so I'll show a little bit more as we go along. Abolish is a legitimate translation of both of those Greek words, and there's two different Greek words that are used there. But one of them means literally to overthrow or to annul, to render vain. And so a number of different words could be used, and it would explain better those two passages, or answer, if you will, those two passages. And those two passages are something that has been brought up numerous times with people looking for, thinking that, I found a contradiction. Well, part of this has to do with the way the word was actually translated, and so you can see that some of the things that happened because of that. Overall, the New American Standard finds itself in a peculiar position, wanting to have updated some of the archaisms that are found in the American Standard, but caused doubt in a lot of people because of those passages dealing with Jesus' deity and those messianic prophecies, and so and even allowing for easy divorce. And so what people did was they even though those issues were corrected, it's almost as if the damage was done. And so though it's a good translation overall, not many people use it. And probably because of some have known these things in the past, and therefore it's just not talked about very much. It is, I think overall, it is certainly a good translation. It is considered to be one of the most literal translations, and yet it is still much more readable maybe than some others. There is Denny Petrillo, who is the director of Bear Valley, in one of his commentaries, he makes a statement where he's talking about the New American Standard, and he says that in fact you find in some of these passages that I've got listed here some premillennial bias, actually, and that's some of the things that we talked about that can happen with some of these committees, and the New American Standard has been subjected to some of those very things. It does seem to lack some of the overall scholarship, if you will, of kind of what set the stage was the King James, obviously, and the American Standard 1901. And so it does seem to lack a little bit of scholarship, even though it is a more literal translation. And if you know some of the issues that are in it, certainly you can find your way. Most critics agree that it may be guilty of interpreting passages in the marginal notes. And so that goes back again to those footnotes that are there that dealt with the Messiah, that dealt with the deity of Christ, that dealt with maybe even some of these other things. And so in the marginal notes, sometimes you will read something and it'll be talking about the Israel of God in a passage like Galatians 6:16 or something like that. And you pick up a premillennial bias, and you can read that in it. Here's one. Here's another one that I believe probably John 10 and verse 30, and again, I remember talking about this in our Bible class on John, where Jesus makes a statement, I and my Father are one. In the marginal notes, in the footnotes, you have a statement that is made. It reads, a unity or of one essence. However, the immediate context of John 10 does not suggest this kind of oneness that Jesus had in mind. If you go back and look at John chapter 10, he's literally saying, I and my Father are one. I am. Remember the I am statements? What do they point out? What are they teaching? Every time he makes a statement like that, I am. Before Abraham was, I am. I am God. I and my Father are one. That's what he's teaching. And that's what's recorded for us by inspiration in John's account. And yet the marginal note in that particular passage, just to give one example, you find some interpreting being done in those passages like Ms. Jean was talking about in paraphrases and things like that. And so this is where you have this in the case of a marginal note versus just outright changing the text itself. Wilcox gives a good summary of this. Ultimately, he says it's a dignified translation. It's not colloquial. It does not use slang words, so it's good for devotional readings or to be read for use in worship. And by the way, when you read some of the paraphrases or so-called Bibles like the Message and others, that's nothing. You would read that and you go, that's not anything that needs to be read out loud in a worship service ever. And it doesn't have that feel of giving God honor and glory in worship. And so one of the points being made, though, is that certainly the New American Standard does have its place in worship and devotional readings and so forth. A few critics have said the New American Standard is not new in that sense, nor is it related to the American Standard 1901. And the point being made that it goes back to other Greek text and not the main Greek text of the American Standard 1901. All right, the New King James. If it seems like I'm flying, I am. I'm having to move on. Excuse me. All right, so the New King James. Probably, if I had to guess, I haven't polled or anything like that, but I would guess that probably there's more people use the New King James here than do other translations. Probably King James, New King James, and then English Standard, and I know a couple people use the New American Standard, but the majority probably, I would say, fall in here with the New King James. So 1982 by Thomas Nelson Corporation, and so this was a book publishing company that put this work together. And its purpose was to modernize the King James. One thing that they didn't have to worry about, Lee, was that issue of copyright. The King James is not copyrighted in that way. And so they were attempting, obviously, then to modernize the King James. You can find that in its preface as well, relying on the same text that the King James did. 119 scholars were used, and they kept in mind the same purpose when the King James came about. Remember, their purpose, we read this, was not to produce a new translation. And so their purpose was to take something that was already there, that was good in its way that it was translated, and take it and update it some. That's what they were attempting to do. And so this is the work of the New King James, relying again on the similar text of the King James and so forth. The New Testament was completed in 1979, both Old and New put together in one copy in 1982. And again, 119 scholars, editors, and church theologians, as how it's worded, were used for this purpose. The New King James Committee, they reverence the Bible as the inspired Word of God. You find that in their preference. Most of these will make a statement to that fact. In fact, does anybody remember the Star Bible, American Standard? You got one? Do you remember so there was a New Testament version, just a little small pocket edition, and that one may do it as well. I know Star Bible, when they published their copy of the American Standard, they put stars, hence Star Bible, they put stars out by passages that dealt with salvation. And some of them giving you notes, where else to go next and so forth. And numerous other Bibles have done it. Well, the King James, or the New King James rather, when they came out originally, they had a slimline edition in 1982 that had a section, "What must I do to be saved?" I just tell you that they didn't finish. Okay? Much like the denominational world. It may start out real well. Jesus died for you, and then after that it gets pretty muddy. And the New King James did the same thing, and so they stopped short of following the true plan of salvation found in the New Testament. We talked about the issue that the King James had with the inconsistency in those passages that were clearly marked, or should have been marked as Hades, and those marked as hell. There's certainly a difference in that, and so there is a consistency in the New King James. They fixed that. Passover was supplied for Easter, for clarity. We talked about that passage as well when we went through the King James. They took away the ambiguous term unknown from 1 Corinthians 14, verse 2, that certainly has caused many people to have maybe some interesting doctrinal ideas about speaking in tongues and so forth. But the word unknown is not found in the original. They took it out. And so in fact, the King James says, "For he that speaketh in an unknown tongue." Now, what's interesting is that the King James italicized the word. So you knew, if you're reading the King James, you knew that was a word that had been supplied. I'm not sure why it was supplied, but for he who speaks in a tongue is how it should read. 1 Corinthians 14 and verse 2. And so the New King James corrected that. The first edition, however, had Jesus' bones being broken in 1 Corinthians 11:24. What's the problem with that? That's a contradiction, right? And the psalmist, prophesied of that very thing. Not a bone would be broken. And we know that certainly is the case. But the first edition that came out, of course, it's been corrected in other editions, but the New King James, as have several, corrupts Galatians 2:16, where it reads faith in Christ. I talked about that. I think even the American Standard has difficulty with that. The definite article, the, is supposed to be there. It is in the original. And even if it wasn't, the passage clearly is talking about the system of faith. But without the, somebody might come along and read it as, well, just having faith in Christ, right? It's faith only is ultimately, could be taught from that passage. But that would be erroneous. The same error is committed in these other passages, Galatians 2:20, Philippians 3:9, and so forth. The golden rule, as we know it, in Matthew 7:12, is diluted somewhat. What you would want men to do to you is how it's translated versus should do to you. Now, there's a stark difference in treating someone the way that I want them to treat me versus the way that they should be treating me. Because there's a higher standard, right? It's not me. There's a higher standard. And so some have termed this, because of this translation, and numerous modern versions have done this as well, called it the golden plated rule when you read it in these versions. But clearly it's problematic. New King James removed the ETH endings at the end of verbs that was found in the King James American Standard, eliminating the reader's ability to recognize a continuous action verb that was used just from reading it in the English. The New King James used an oblique typeface when it was a quote from the Old Testament, and so it was easily recognized as a quote from the Old Testament. And I think that's a great study tool. That's certainly helpful. It did not tamper with the deity of Jesus or his mother's virgin conception. There is a large problem, and you'll kind of see a trend with some of these newer translations or newer versions, because again, the word porneia, translated in Matthew 19:9, Matthew 5:32, here they use sexual immorality. And what's interesting is you would think, now you see there's a lot of verses here where that word typically found as fornication, by the way, in King James and the American Standard, translated as sexual immorality in these passages. And then turn around and inconsistently translate it fornication in these other passages. My question is why? Well, I don't know. I can't read the minds of the committee. But what I know is sexual immorality, again, loosens that idea. Now, anytime that you're sitting down and you're dealing with the topic of marriage, divorce, and remarriage, and you come across this passage, you're teaching people what this word means in the original, because you're having to kind of get down to the nitty-gritty about what's going on and what is the reason, the allowance for putting away one's mate. It has nothing to do with death. The only other reason given there is fornication, the word porneia, which is an illicit sexual act, not just loosened because of these terms that are used, in our modern vernacular, that could be a range of any other things. And so it would add and allow somebody to put their mate away for the use of pornography or something else. And so this has to do with the illicit sexual act, which had to do with sex outside of marriage, clearly. So homosexuality, bestiality, those kind of things. If you look up the word fornication, look up the word porneia, you'll see that there is a difference. It's not just a strong desire for something. And so it's a much stronger word than that. And Jesus used that word on purpose, by the way. And so we need to be careful about loosening that idea that Jesus certainly taught here. And so it would give the wrong thought about putting one's mate away when they may not have a scriptural right to do so, depending on the situation. And so, again, the New King James does that. The New American Standard did that, even in a bad way. Yes, ma'am.
So what term is used as far as adultery?
What?
Because it's referred to as adultery in
Yes.
King James. So is that pornea also?
That word is not pornea, but I'll get you that.
Okay.
But let's pick up there and let's kind of deal with this, because several translations have this particular issue, and we want to make sure that we're covering it. Because, again, when somebody asks me, okay, well, what translation or what version should I use? There's a couple of key passages I basically send them to so that they can see how these words or sentences are translated and make up for their mind, for their own mind, how they're going to deal with that. In that, and so this is not the only issue. There are others, but anyway, we'll pick up there, Lord willing, next week, and I'll write that down so I don't forget to deal with that. So thank you for your attention.